we've used slides which have got a slightly tinted background, and also we've gone with a navy blue font. If you can't print onto tinted paper, try and change the colour of the ink if that's possible to reduce the contrast. So black on white tends to start these visual distortion effects that some students report. Think about spacing as well, the spacing of the letters in the words, the spacing of the words on the line, and also the lines on the page. Make sure there's plenty of space, because if students are using technology devices to scan or to read individual lines, they will need a bit more space there. So do think about the space. In terms of the medium, paper used to be the default. So many of us are teaching online now, of course, that paper isn't necessarily what we're all using. We might be using audio, which is great. Bear in mind that your hearing impaired students might also need the transcript. Video is really helpful because it adds more context. Bear in mind that your visually impaired students might need the audio description of what's happening. Remember that the real world is full of things that we can use, tactile, kinesthetic materials that we can bring into the classroom. Even if your students at home, they might have their own examples of the items, and in an ideal world, of course, we would use a combination of materials to enhance the sensory effect. And I'd like to hand back now to David, who's going to extend this idea of accessibility and talk about accessibility in terms of age appropriacy.
Thank you very much, Anne-Margaret. So thinking about children and teenagers from a design point of view, well, number one is a highly creative outcome. If we want children to engage with diversity issues through our materials, we need to make our outcomes as creative as possible. Linked to this, we have number two, and the need to make our tasks as multimodal as possible to reach and teach as many, as Carol Reed would say, as many of our children and teenagers as possible. And also linked to this, you can see from the different hands, the need to have a variety of personalized responses. If we're thinking about shifting their perspectives, encouraging perspective change, or community action outside of the classroom around inclusion and diversity, personalized responses are really important. So those are some issues for design. Moving on to selection, if you're trying to select suitable materials to be more inclusive and to focus on diversity with children and teenagers, number four looks at different entry points or ways into different diversity issues. Some of my favorite entry points to help children or teenagers focus on diversity would be children's literature. So picture books, verse novels, graphic novels, these are some of my favorite ways. And then number five, encouraging through the selection of material, genuine communication where children and teenagers can give real opinions, real views, and real perspectives around the materials. And to do this, obviously, they need the language. So number six illustrates the need for what Ros Ivanich calls person-respecting language and person-respecting vocabulary. And I feel this needs to be explicitly focused on through our materials in age-appropriate, child-friendly, and teen-friendly ways. Moving on then to using materials in an inclusive way in the classroom that fosters interest in diversity and respect for diversity. So number seven, context is key. So setting the context in a way which grabs children or teenagers' interest through clips, through visuals, through carefully selected materials can really help. Linked to this, rather than giving lessons on diversity and lessons on inclusion, foster discovery learning techniques where children can work collaboratively, conduct mini research, well scaffolded research to discover elements of difference, diversity, and also interculturality. Linked to this, number nine, we really need to move beyond comprehension through our materials, and we need to help children and teenagers foster deeper learning. So adopting a more deep learning approach in number nine. Finally then, the importance of reflective reviewing. to enable children to really shift perspective, think about their own perspective, challenge different perspectives. It's very important that we have regular reviewing in our through our materials. So those would be my 10 areas. Now I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to focus on these areas from a literature point of view. Thank you.
Rob, your microphone is muted, so we can't hear you. Can you just check that for us?
Sorry.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Right, let's begin with a couple of absolute classics, Robinson Crusoe and Jane Eyre. And let's have a look at the way that Robinson Crusoe talks about what happened just after he rescued Friday. I let him know his name should be Friday, which was the day I saved his life. I likewise taught him to say master, and then let him know that was to be my name. Well, we might ask ourselves there, how come Robinson Crusoe doesn't say, my name is Robinson, instead of master? And why does he never make the attempt to find out what Friday is really called, instead of imposing a name himself? Jane Eyre. Now, the hero of Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester, has a wife, a mad and violent woman who's kept locked up in the attic. Her name is Bertha. This is one of the ways she is described. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It grovelled seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange animal. That is my wife, said he. Well, this poor lady, it, animal, beast, is presented always through the eyes of Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre. She's never given the chance of explaining herself. Now, both Friday and Bertha are dominated by the voices of Robinson and Rochester and Jane Eyre. Let's see if we can give them a voice. A trend for novelists revisiting classic works and then rewriting them from a different point of view started with Wide Sargasso Sea, where Jean Rhys gives a voice to Bertha, the mad woman in the attic. She recounts in the first person her upbringing in Jamaica and how she met Rochester and how he became cold to her and betrayed her, and this contributes in part to her madness. Robinson Crusoe is revisited by Coetzee in an interesting novel where a woman, Susan Barton, is washed up on a desert island, finds Robinson and Friday there. They are rescued. Robinson dies on the way back to England, and telling the story is left in the hands of Susan Barton. Friday cannot. He's lost his tongue. It's a mystery that remains. This has become so popular, revisiting stories from a different viewpoint. You find it in young adult literature with novels narrated from the point of view of Ophelia or Rosalind, the girl that Romeo loves at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet. The principle I'm putting forward is quite simply to find out which characters don't have voices and give them a voice. You can allow them to narrate their story from their own point of view or invent a backstory for them. The methodology is already there. Classically third-person narratives and first-person, sorry, my time is up, first-person diaries, letters and blogs and interviews. Linda Ruas, I'm going to hand over to you now from GSIG. Linda.
Linda, are you there?
Thanks. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Is that okay? Right. Okay, so I'm Linda, representing the Global Issues SIG, and I've got two questions to talk about. The first one about representation. Now, I feel the answer to this long question on the slide there, do the ELT materials represent our students' backgrounds and cultures equally and inclusively? I feel the answer is no, but that's maybe because of the context that I teach in myself. Let me give a few examples. A few years ago, I was in a makeshift wooden hut in the refugee camp in Calais, packed with Sudanese and Afghanis desperate to learn some survival English really fast. And piled up in the corner were hundreds of donated ELT course books and resource books. None of them had anything remotely suitable or relevant for those students there. Since then, I've been going to Guinea-Bissau in West Africa in my college holidays to work with English teachers there and help out with training, materials and curriculum. And I put out an appeal to a few college libraries for donations that I could take. Not very successful. The dictionaries were good. A lot of the graded readers were not suitable at all. Hardly any had a context that the students could relate to. And there was a lovely series of readers about famous scientists and philosophers, but these were, of course, 90% European. My main work is training and teaching ESOL in a further education college in London, and that's ESOL, which is to asylum seekers, refugees, and long-term migrants. And my students come from Somalia, Nepal, Algeria, Afghanistan, Equatorial Guinea, and many other countries. Apart from the government Skills for Life material, there's hardly anything that reflects their backgrounds and cultures. So what do? We mostly create our own materials or spend a long time adapting anything that's published. On to question 2, how can we make materials accessible to teachers teaching with no or few resources? I put this out to 3 or 4 WhatsApp groups that I'm involved with in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is what they said. We need to make published ELT materials free or very cheap, simple, and valuing the local contexts. Free or cheap so that both the teachers and students can afford them. Simple, for example, one generative context is far more useful than pages of complex exercises. A couple of examples from very simple teaching in Guinea-Bissau would be a lesson on writing instructions for a visitor for getting cashew nuts out of the fruit. That's the main export in Guinea-Bissau. This would include vocabulary, imperative, sequencing, just one simple generative context. Or a lesson on ways of getting from Bissau to Dakar in Senegal. Vocabulary, means of transport, first conditionals to compare the options. Just a very, very simple context again. And the idea of valuing the local context. A point the teachers in Benin made was, how can people in Europe write suitable materials for them in Benin if they hadn't taught there? Classes of 80, no resources except a blackboard, no internet, of course, no access to internet in most places. Some teachers mentioned the British Council resources as useful, but only if their internet was cheap enough and strong enough to actually download the materials. And then the teachers need to pay for any photocopies they use or printing. Some mentioned they get anything free they could, used to get anything free they could on the internet. Now they realise that it's more suitable to develop and share their own exercises. We just published a resource book, a publication on the GSIG website about teaching in Africa. So please have a look at that. And I think I'm handing over to Alexandra Popovsky now.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay, so I'm going to take a look at tokenism because it's such an important issue when writing ELT materials. And according to Macmillan Online Dictionary, it is the practice of doing something in order to make people believe that you are being fair and including all types of people and issues, and that is not really true. Or to put it simply, tokenism is inclusion for the sake of inclusion. So when we start writing ELT materials, we need to ask ourselves why we are including certain topics, communities, and cultures. Is it because we are ticking boxes and making a straight line and winning? Or is it because we see their actual value?
Your webcam is not on.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah, sorry, it's the connection. Okay, great. So these are some things that I would suggest so that we avoid tokenism when writing ELT materials. So first of all, do your research. Before you start writing materials, ask yourself, what do I know about this topic, about this community, about this culture? What are my opinions, attitudes, and beliefs about that? Will that influence my writing angle, and if so, in what way? So you need to make an informed decision about what to include in your materials, because very often materials are actually a very good opportunity to spread and feed stereotypes. So the next thing would be to avoid showcasing. That means that you do not put issues such as gender, disability, race, culture, or orientation on the show, on display as something that is so different, so strange, so unusual, and now you have to include that in your materials and they have to be discussed. All these are actually part of our society and our realities, and as such should be treated with respect and not be showcased as something unusual and different. You need to reflect learners' realities. Learners live in a real world. They do not live in this dimension where everybody has the same skin color, speaks Queen's English, drinks afternoon tea, or plays bridge. Our realities are much more diverse and much more colorful than that, because our realities are not black and white. They're gray and yellow and pink and orange and any color you want them to be. So that's what we need to do. We need to reflect these colorful realities in our materials. Create connections. Create characters, create stories, create texts in your materials that are relevant and relatable. Because when learners make connections with what they are learning, what they are reading in your materials, they will enhance their own learning process. And the last thing I would suggest is that you have a sidekick, meaning ask a friend or a colleague, and it would be perfect if they're actually teachers, so that they go through your materials, they try them out with their students, and then tell you whether you're being tokenistic or not. But I think that the best sidekick you could have and you should have is actually your editor, because editor is the person that keeps you grounded and actually makes sure that you are not just ticking boxes. So I hope these suggestions can help you avoid tokenism next time you sit down and start writing your own materials. David?
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. So now we're going to move to your questions for the remainder of this panel. Can everyone please come back? Put your hands on, please, ready for the questions. So first of all, then, we have a question for Anne-Margaret, and this question comes from Jenny. And Jenny asks, what about using colour to highlight grammatical structure? What would you suggest?
Yeah, hi Jenny, thank you for the question. I know a lot of teachers do like to use colour as a way of highlighting different parts of speech, and it can be a very powerful learning tool. But what we need to make clear is that there's nothing that suits everybody. One size doesn't fit all. So the first thing we need to establish is that our students actually can see the different colours. And if you have students who are having trouble distinguishing between colours, maybe think about using different shapes. Drawing a box, drawing a circle or a heart or something around different parts of speech instead. But yes, colour is a really useful tool if everybody can access it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got another one from Abdul Muhaimin, and he asks Anne-Margaret as well, what about texture?
What about texture? I definitely advocate multisensory materials, as multisensory as possible. So that does include very tactile kinesthetic materials, including different textures. And I think particularly for students who have low functional vision, that can be a really helpful starting point. If you want to go down the route of using different textures for different parts of speech, that would be a really interesting project, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, thank you, and Margaret. So for me, I have a question from Pete, who's asking, can I recommend research into the effectiveness of discovery learning in ELT? So I'm particularly interested in interculturality and intercultural learning with children and teenagers. And the research I find most interesting and very new, actually, and very fresh, is a journal, one of my favorite journals. I mean, there are several, but one of my favorite would be the Intercultural Communication Education Journal. And that's a couple of years old only, so it's a very new journal. And some of the research being published in there is very interesting around discovery learning. And also for me, I have a question from Joanna, and Joanna's asking about articles based on my ideas. Well, I can recommend, I don't know if you've seen the blog post I did for Morsig, and that was the September 2019 blog post. So that links and expands on some of the things I've said. And I think, Alex, we're going to write up our responses to some of these questions for Morsig again, so we can respond in more detail. Okay, so we have, just looking, so Pete's asking for Alex, where do you draw the line between tokenism and representation?
Well, to be honest, I think that's a very tricky area, and it depends a lot on your previous experience and the brief that you get from your publisher. But personally, as a materials writers, I think that we need to decide on our own and make, as I said, an informed decision when we start or before we start writing materials. So we need to actually have a set of principles that we follow when we write ELT materials. And one of these principles should be to avoid tokenism. And there are a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration, so it's not an easy question to answer in such a short time. So I would say that, first of all, make an informed decision, create your own set of principles, and then just hope for the best, to be honest, because when you deal with editors and publishers, it is tricky to draw the line between tokenism and representation. It's much easier if you're writing materials for your own classes.
Thank you for that, Alex. So we have a question here for Rob from Tom, who's asking, are graded readers the best way for students to learn about diversity?
Hello, Tom. Yes, I know Tom, who's a champion of graded readers. I'd never thought of that, Tom. I must say, I'd thought that it was the content of a particular book rather than the mode in which it's presented, whether it's got simplified vocabulary or not. I can't, unless you're thinking of something that I'm missing. No, I mean, the graded readers are fantastic for beginning readers, but it's not necessarily a vehicle that's better for presenting diversity than non-graded material, unless, as I